Hello, my name is Ben Ochoa. This is an analysis of the 2011 film Bridesmaids, created for interpersonal communication. My partner in this project is Bree Shakur. Here is a brief synopsis of the film's plot. Annie is a single, mid-30s woman living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her best friend, Lillian, has been in her life since a very young age. Lillian gets engaged and asks Annie to be her maid of honor. It is also shown that Annie used to own a bakery that was shut down during the recession. She now works at a jewelry store. At Lillian's engagement party, Annie meets Lillian's friend, Helen, who Annie immediately dislikes due to Helen seemingly having everything together. Both Annie and Helen are obviously trying to be Lillian's best friend simultaneously. After the engagement party, Annie is pulled over by a Milwaukee state trooper on her way home. During their conversation, the trooper, Nathan Rhodes, makes the connection that Annie used to run the bakery Cake Baby, where Rhodes sometimes patronized. After an unsuccessful bachelorette party organized by Annie goes sour, Lillian has Helen take over these types of duties. This only further deepens the animosity between Helen and Annie. Annie and Rhodes explore their relationship further as Lillian's wedding day approaches. At Lillian's bridal shower, Annie's pent-up frustrations about Lillian and Helen's relationship comes out in an explosive emotional display. After Annie's tantrum, Lillian disinvites her from the bridal party, the wedding, and ultimately ends their friendship right then and there. Things have also now gone sour with Annie's relationship with Rhodes. In addition to this, she also loses her job, moves in with her mother, all seems lost. In the end, on Lillian's wedding day, Helen arrives at Annie's door urgently needing help. She cannot find Lillian, with only hours to go before the ceremony. Annie knows to look for Lillian at Lillian's old apartment. The two reconnect, apologize to each other, and reconcile their differences that have occurred throughout the film. Annie and Helen, after the stressful occurrence of losing then finding Lillian, strike up their own friendship. At the end of the wedding, Rhodes is waiting for Annie by his patrol car. They reconcile, kiss, and drive away together from the wedding. In this analysis, I will be discussing the relationship between Annie and Rhodes. My partner Bree will be discussing the relationship between Annie and Helen. Annie and Rhodes' relationship quickly goes through several stages of coming together as well as coming apart. As explained in Chapter 8 of our textbook, initiating is the beginning of every relationship. This occurs after the engagement party when Annie is pulled over by Rhodes. Although their relationship begins on a disciplinary note with regard to Rhodes pulling her over, both he and Annie plant the seeds for later interaction on the experimenting level of their relationship. This comes to fruition later in the film. After a night out, Rhodes and Annie connect physically and spend the night together at Rhodes' house. This is the intensifying step of coming together, as described in Chapter 8. Here lies the crux. The morning after, Annie wakes up to a beaming Rhodes, who is genuinely thrilled at their connection from the previous night. Annie, on the other hand, is somewhat tentative. This plays out when Rhodes surprises Annie by showing her a collection of baking ingredients that he went out and purchased earlier that same morning. For Rhodes, he sees this as an opportunity for them to deepen their relationship and enter into what Chapter 8 describes as the bonding phase. Annie's reaction is starkly different than Rhodes' hope. According to Luciano Liabate, in his article Styles in Intimate Relationships, the ARC model, or ARC, Liabate describes the progression of the components comprising the ARC model as A, apathy, R, reactivity, and C, conductivity. In the baking scene, or lack thereof of baking, Annie and Rhodes, Annie is scared and unwilling to sacrifice her identity as she knows it. This is what Liabate points out as a retaliation designed to keep a relationship either the same or to revert to a less intense level. In this case, Annie is trying to revert the connection they made from the previous night on that physical level and take it to an even more basic place. She is embodying the reactivity component of the arc. model, which is described by Lebate. Rhodes has paved the way for them to connect and deepen their relationship, however. This would further them in the coming together phase if it was successful. Annie, however, limits this by drawing away from this invitation to other levels of intimacy outside of their sexual connection from the night before. My recommendation on how they could better mitigate this, in regards to that, if Annie had slowed down her reactivity and taken stock of Rhodes's gesture of the baking ingredients, she could have accepted it for what it was and began deepening their relationship. Instead, Annie further hinders herself from connecting with others, which lasts pretty much until the end of the film, when all the reconciliations are made between herself, Lillian, Helen, Rhodes, and all the other individuals that she's come into contact to and come in contact with and burnt bridges with.
Hello, my name is Bree. I will be focusing my portion of the project on the interpersonal relationship between Annie and Heather. Heather is immediately, upon meeting, deemed our antagonist, and Annie is our protagonist. Annie is, as Ben was saying, Liliana, our bride's long-term friend, and Heather is a fairly new friend. Upon their first meeting, Annie says, "Oh my gosh, you're so pretty." And Heather says, "Wow, that's so cute." And that is girl code for, we are not going to be friends. This is not going to go well. So immediately, we don't like her. The relationship continues. Liliana requests of Annie, "Hey, this girl's going to be in my bridal party. Please be nice to her. Please try to make an effort." Because there's immediately hostility. Not a good vibe. Heather and Annie are playing tennis together. It is our first one-on-one that they've had. Again, hostility. But then there's this moment that they have, this opportunity for connection. Heather is at the club, the country club, and her stepkids come into the picture. She calls them, calling her kids, "Hey kids." They immediately let everybody know, "Hey, that's my stepmom, we're your stepkids." And I think one of them says something along the lines of, "Fuck off, Heather." Not a way to talk to a mom, not a way to talk to a stepmom. Immediately something that should be hurtful. Heather dismisses it. She laughs it off. I think this is a good example of in chapter 7, Johara's window. We build trust in our interpersonal relationships as we self-disclose, revealing information about ourselves. By not disclosing this in the moment, I believe she broke trust with Annie. I think this is the moment that dehumanized Heather to Annie and the moment that solidified their relationship as enemies. By portraying this shallow, known self to Annie, it was a pivotal turning point. She was protecting her hidden self from Annie, her image and her vulnerabilities, not expressing those vulnerabilities. And I believe that if Heather would have exposed a more open self with Annie, this entire relationship would have been completely different. Throughout the entire film, we see Annie's love for honesty. We see her, more than that, value for honesty in relationships. We see this first when she is telling Liliana in an opening scene about her relationship that is only sexual, not good for her, with this man. And in defense to Liliana, she says, "Oh, but he's honest." This is the first glimpse that we get of her value for that. Secondly, we see it in her lifestyle. She lives a very honest lifestyle. She is not portraying a certain image. She is direct and to the point. Lastly, we see this later on in the film when Annie has hit rock bottom and she is refusing to leave the house. Everything has gone wrong. She is at the end of herself, so to say, and an unlikely friend comes and encourages her on the couch, gives her some brutal honesty, and it is the only thing that revives Annie. She is then re-inspired with life, not from encouragement, but not from this false encouragement, but from this brutal honesty met with love. She receives this very well. And so I believe that if Heather in that moment would have stepped into that vulnerability and allowed Annie to see how that may have affected her, or use that as a connection point and allowed that vulnerability into her life and allowed that hidden self to be more of an open self, I believe that that would have completely changed their relationship. Another reasoning for this would be when both characters are at rock bottom at a similar moment in that story as when her friend came and with brutal honesty encouraged her. Both characters hit rock bottom, and Heather is knocking on the door, needing Annie's help. Later, Heather discloses that open self with her and lets her know that it did come from this jealousy, from this protective place, that she's not getting attention from her husband, that this relationship with Liliana was so important because of that. And it is at this moment that Annie reluctantly, but nonetheless forgives her for those actions, because what I believe is that value for honesty, because that was that moment of vulnerability that went from dehumanizing Heather to rehumanizing her and making her a person. And of course, we see that in chapter 3 of our book, that was an example of emotional loneliness. Emotional loneliness results when an individual feels that he or she does not have an emotional connection with others. We generally get these emotional connections through associations with loved ones, with close friends. If an individual is estranged from their family, in this case, maybe Heather, from her husband being on work trips so much, feels estranged from him, from that previous poor relationship with her stepkids, feels that conflict with him. This could be why she did feel that emotional loneliness and did cling so deeply to Liliana. Even though throughout the film we do see her having these several close but shallow relationships with people. She seems to know everybody well. She seems to have these ins with people, but since they are lacking that depth because she has that hidden self and she is so reluctant to have that open self, they are not deep. They are not fulfilling that need for her. I will leave you with this, the article by Hallie Liberto, and her article, Exploitation and the Vulnerability Clause. It is not safe to love one another. If safety is what one values most, the womb or the grave is the best place for one. And between the two, one will want the best approximate one can get to these places where one is sheltered from or beyond hurt. One will opt for a place where one cannot respond emotionally to the emotions and other states of minds of others, cannot be pleased by pleasure, disappointed by their lack of pleasure, or hurt by their indifference. Angry at their failure to be angered by insults, saddened by their choice to withdraw rather than forgivably harm, and so on, there is no safe love. I think that if Heather would have been brave and vulnerable and chosen that safe love, she would have found herself a completely new group of friends that could, maybe have filled that spot that had that longing. But because she chose to value her hidden self and protect that and use that to hurt other people, because she did not step into that vulnerability, ended really poorly. And the only conclusion that they had was when she did decide to be vulnerable and was able to get everything that she was trying to get before by being nasty and mean and ugly.